I've been playing Arknights Endfield second beta for about 2 days now, and the more I play, the more addictive the combat becomes, especially when I get my hands on new characters. And the reason why the combat can be so engaging is because of one simple mechanic that they implemented, which makes it very different from more popular gacha games like Genshin Impact and Withering Waves, and that mechanic is combo skills. To put it simply, every character can perform combo skills, but you need to fulfill certain conditions before you can proc or activate a combo skill. But aside from that, you have the usual mixing and matching different elements, or arts as they refer to it in Endfield, basic attacks, skill, and then the character's ultimate, which are more common in open world gacha games. So in today's video, I'm going to be taking you through everything related to Endfield's combat system to help you decide if it's worth your time or not when it gets officially released in 2026. But before we dive back into the video, I want to give huge thanks to Raid for supporting the channel. Now, I don't cover the game here on the channel, but you can support me by downloading it with the link in the description. It really helps me to continue making these type of videos for you guys. They're giving all new players $200 worth of free rewards if you use the link in the description. So it's a win-win for everyone. Just click the link, follow the steps to set up your new account, and start playing. And do keep in mind that checking out the game or recommending it to friends and family who are more into strategy-based games directly helps me to keep making videos for you guys. Now, the first thing we need to look at is the indicators on your screen. And for those on controller, this is how it's going to look like. You have the skills and ultimate indicators on the bottom right hand side, and then you have your characters or operators as they refer to them in Endfield right here. But for those who will be playing with mouse and keyboard, let me show you guys exactly how it looks like for you. It's much more simpler if you're going to go by mouse and keyboard. You can see that all your operators are right here on the bottom left corner, and when you begin to attack, you will see that you have their ultimate and skills on the bottom right hand side, just like so. Now, I mainly play on controller, so I'll be switching to that to continue the combat guide. Essentially, how the combat works is that you can have 4 characters on the field, and you can switch to any of them at any time that you want. Now, the moment you approach enemies, your characters will start fighting by default. So if I switch to the MC and I start attacking, you guys can see right here that my characters start to attack the enemies by default. And essentially what they do is that they'll just be spamming their basic attack buttons. They're not going to be using skills, combo skills, or stuff like that. They're just going to be spamming basic attacks, as you guys can see right here. Now, with that out of the way, let's cover basic attacks. You can spam every character's basic attacks just like so, and different characters will have different animations. However, the last attack, which is called Final Strike in Endfield, regenerates a lot of SP or skill point, and those are the 3 gauges that you can see on the character's health bar in yellow. If I use the character's skill, it consumes 1 SP gauge, and if I use it again, it consumes another SP gauge, and if I use it again, it consumes the last SP gauge. Whatever skill that you use, whether it's the on-field character or any other character on the team, will consume 1 SP gauge. And keep in mind that you can activate the skills of other characters without actually switching to them, and we'll get into that very shortly. If you run out of SP, spamming basic attacks and using the last stage or the last strike, or the final strike as they call it in Endfield, will help you regenerate more SP. However, it's recommended in your team building to have a unit that regenerates SP at a faster rate so that you can spam your skills more often. Now, whilst I'm attacking the enemy, you can see that there's a white gauge building up below its health bar. And if you fully build up the gauge, what it's going to do is that it's going to stagger the enemy, and your character will be able to perform a finisher to deal massive damage. Keep in mind that any type of damage that you do to the enemy will fill the stagger bar. However, physical damage like lift do significantly more stagger damage, which immobilizes the enemy much more frequently. But we'll get into those very shortly. For now, let's cover dodges. You can dodge with any character about 3 times to deplete the dodge gauge, as you guys can see right there. However, if you dodge right before the attack hits you, you're going to perform a perfect dodge, which reduces the amount of stamina that you're going to consume. So you can see that the dodge window is actually pretty large, and I even dodged before the attack reached me, but I was able to activate the perfect dodge, as you guys saw right there. Now let's cover skills. you can use the skills of every character in the team. And since I'm on controller, if I hold my left bumper, you can see that it brings out the skill in addition to their ultimate. But their ultimates are not full yet. That is why it's a bit dimmed, as you guys can see right there. However, their skills are still active, and they're active because I have SP to spend. So I can use Pogranicznik's skill, which looks like this. Now I can use Snowshine's skill, which looks like this. It sets up a wall in front of the character, and you can use it to counter the enemy's attack just like so. So this means that if Pogranicznik is your main character or the character that you main, you can decide not to switch to any character and just have him on field, because you can use the skills and ultimate of every single character in the team. Now let's cover combo skills. And combo skills require specific conditions to activate, but they do a lot of damage and helps you to apply some statuses on the enemy. Now right here, I'm going to be using Shen as an example. When you go to the character screen, you can see that every character has 4 skills in general. This will be their basic attacks, this will be their skill, and this will be the combo skill, and this will be the ultimate. Now for Shen's combo skill, it says that when an enemy becomes vulnerable, keep in mind that vulnerable is basically a status that characters that do physical damage can mostly apply. So if we take the administrator, for example, or the MC, using the MC's skill will apply vulnerable to the enemy. So all I have to do is go in combat and use the MC's skill, and you see that Shen's image will pop up on the screen, and pressing the assigned button will activate an animation and allow her to do damage to the enemy just like so. And you can see that the administrator's combo skill will also activate, because the MC's combo skill requires at least one character in the team to use a combo skill. So using Shen's combo skill procs administrator's combo skill. And that's actually what makes combat in Enfield much more engaging, because you get rewarded by doing more damage, being able to apply statuses on the enemy with combo skills so that your DPS unit can do even more damage. So it's not just about spamming skills, ultimates, and basic attacks. Now let's cover damage types. We have 2 types of damage in the game, and those are physical and elemental damage, but the game calls elemental damage arts damage, so do keep in mind that if I use elemental or arts interchangeably, it means the same thing. So you can see right here that the MC, this is the basic attacks, it does physical damage, the skill also does physical damage, and the ultimate also does physical damage. But if we switch to Ardelia, you can see that the basic attacks do green damage numbers, which means that it's nature damage, and the skill also does nature damage, which is in green, as you guys can see right there. However, do keep in mind that doing elemental damage doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to apply the element, because we have different skills that inflicts different element. And that's what makes Enfield different in terms of elemental applications when you compare it to other games like Genshin Impact, for example. Now, to add more clarification, let me use Wolfguard for you guys to see the difference between elemental damage and elemental infliction. So you can see that Wolfguard's basic attacks do heat damage, which is in orange, as you guys can see right there. However, if you want to apply heat to the enemy, you'll need to use his skill, which applies heat to the enemy, as you guys can see right there. And if you read his kit description, it says here that the final shot applies heat infliction. So basically what I'm trying to say is that doing elemental damage to the enemy doesn't necessarily apply or inflict the element on the enemy. Now let's cover status effects, which is where majority of your damage is going to come from. For physical status, we have vulnerable, and the type of attacks that can inflict vulnerable is lift, crush, breach, and knockdown. When I use Pogranicznik's skill, it does breach damage and apply 1 vulnerable. Now, if I use Shen's skill, it does lift damage and applies 1 vulnerable. If I use the administrator's skill, what is going to happen is that it's going to apply crush. And you saw that it got rid of all the stacks on the enemy to do more damage in return. Now, Pogranicznik's skill does breach damage, and what breach does is that it will consume some of the stacks on the enemy to do damage and make the enemy take more physical damage. And that's actually good for him because he's a physical damage dealer. So when you see that debuff on the enemy, it means that the enemy can take more physical damage. The last physical damage type that apply the vulnerable status that we need to look at is knockdown, but unfortunately I don't have Amber on my account, but this tutorial screen right here will do. You guys can see that when Amber did damage for the first time, it applied the vulnerable status, but the enemy didn't necessarily get knocked down. However, after the second skill, it applied another vulnerable stack on the enemy, but this time, the enemy got knocked down for a short period of time. So if you're using a main damage dealer like Pogranicznik for example, who consumes vulnerable stacks to do more physical damage, then you need to put characters like Shen on your team because her skill does lift physical damage, which always applies the vulnerable status instead of consuming it. And the same applies to Amber for example, who does knockdown physical damage that applies the vulnerable status on the enemy instead of consuming it. Now that we're done with physical statuses, let's move on to elemental statuses or elemental reactions in simple terms. In the second beta, we have 4 types of elements or arts in the game. We have nature, we have electric, we have heat, and then we have cryo. Now I've already showed you guys that doing elemental damage doesn't necessarily mean that you apply that particular element. So for Wolfguard, his skill will apply heat just like so. You can see the heat symbol beside the enemy's health bar. Now if I use a skill again to inflict heat to the enemy, it's going to trigger heat burst. And essentially what heat burst is that it'll deal big additional instance of damage as you guys saw right there. The same applies to the electric element. If I use Perlica's skill, you see that it applies the electric element and does damage. But if I use the skill again to apply another electric element on the enemy or inflict electric element, it causes electric burst, which does an additional instance of big damage. The same applies to nature. If I use Fluoride's skill, you can see that it applies the nature element. And if I use the skill again, you can see that it will trigger nature burst that does an additional instance of damage to the enemy. The last one is the cryo element. If I use Snowshine's skill, you can see that it applies the cryo element. And if I use the skill again, it does cryo burst that does an additional instance of damage, as you guys can see right there. But you can mix these elements or react them together to achieve a different effect. So for example, if you apply any element on the enemy and then apply heat with Wolfguard, what's going to happen is that you're going to trigger combustion. And what combustion does is that it's going to do heat damage over time, as you can see on the enemy. Now let's cover electrification. If you apply any element on the enemy and then you apply the electric element, what's going to happen is that the enemy is going to be electrified. And when the enemy is electrified, what that means is that the enemy is going to take more damage from art or elemental damage. So let me use Perlica's basic attacks for example. The first basic attack is doing 17. So now let me trigger electrification and see what it does. So the enemy has been electrified, and right now the first one is doing 19 damage. And keep in mind that this is not restricted to the electric element. As long as the enemy is electrified, the enemy will take more elemental damage. Now, if you apply any element and apply nature, what's going to happen is that the enemy is going to be corroded. And when you see the corrosion status on the enemy, it means that all resistance to elemental damage has been reduced. So if you're using a character like Levitain, for example, that does a lot of heat damage, when she pops her ultimate, you need to make sure that the enemy is corroded before you activate her ultimate, so that the enemy's elemental resistance will be reduced. Now, the last reaction that we need to take a look at is solidification. Apply any element. So I'm going to apply the electric element with Perlica and then apply cryo with Snowshine. And what's going to happen is that the enemy is going to be solidified. And you can see that the enemy has this freeze effect on its body. Once the enemy is solidified, if you do any physical damage, that applies the vulnerable status on the enemy is going to remove the solidified status and do shatter damage, which is basically a big physical damage. But do keep in mind that you don't always have to go through the trouble of mixing elements to achieve a desired status effect. A good example is Snowshine. If you take a look at her ultimate description, it says here that the snow zone forcibly applies solidification to enemies caught within it for a certain duration, which makes her very good in Pogranicznik teams because he's a physical damage dealer. So the damage that you can get from Shatter when the enemy is solidified will significantly do more damage. And that basically sums up the combat in Endfield. I tried to be as detailed as possible to help you guys get an idea of what you should expect when the game gets officially released. There are some few things that might change, but honestly, I wouldn't recommend Hypergriff to change anything right now that has to do with combat in Endfield. But in case you have access to the beta and you encountered any problems with combat, do let me know in the comments section. That'll be all for my advanced guide on Enfield's combat system. And don't forget to check out Raid or recommend it to friends and family if you would like to support me in any way. Our Discord link will be in the pinned comment as well if you want a place to chill or hang out. I'm also going to be covering Endfield when it officially releases next year, so be sure to subscribe if you want to see more Endfield content. Catch you guys in the next one. Bye bye.